The docking bay alarms were screaming before I even saw her. I was elbow deep in a coolant line on a cargo hauler when the sound hit, a sharp three-tone pulse that meant a warden ship had entered the station. My hands stopped moving on their own. Nobody on Caldra Station wanted to hear that sound, least of all a human like me, working under a permit that could be cancelled with a single stroke of a Dominion officer's stylus. I set down my tool and looked toward the open bay door. That was when she ran in. She was tall, taller than me, with skin the color of pale copper, and eyes that shifted between silver and blue depending on the light. A Severan. I had seen a few of them before, always at a distance, always surrounded by Dominion guards or wealthy patrons. They were considered elegant, valuable, and owned. Not citizens, property with a pleasant face. She stumbled against a stack of crates, caught herself, and looked straight at me like I was the only solid thing left in the universe. "Please," she said, her voice shaking. "I need somewhere to hide, just for a few minutes." Behind her I could hear boots on metal decking, fast and heavy, the kind of rhythm that only comes from people trained to move as a unit. I did not know her name. I did not know what she had done, or who she belonged to, or what the punishment might be if I was caught helping her. All I knew was the look on her face, and I had seen that look before, back on Earth, in old recordings my grandmother used to show me of people running from things no one should ever have to run from. "Behind the crates," I said, pointing. "Get down and stay quiet." She did not hesitate. She folded herself into the narrow gap between two shipping containers, pulling her long coat tight around her legs so no fabric showed. I grabbed my tool bag and knelt back down at the coolant line, doing my best to look like a bored contractor who had been there for hours. 3 wardens rounded the corner a moment later. Their armor was matte black, stamped with the twin ring insignia of the Dominion, and their faceplates reflected the bay lights like dark mirrors. The lead one stopped a few feet from me and looked around the bay with slow, deliberate movements. "Human," he said, the translator in his collar flattening his voice into something cold and mechanical. "Have you seen a Severan female pass through here? Answer honestly." I looked up at him with the most unremarkable expression I could manage. "I have been staring at this coolant line for the last 40 minutes, I said, "trying to figure out why it keeps freezing over. Haven't seen anyone come through, but if you find out who reset the thermal regulator wrong, send them my way, because I would like to have a word." It was a small joke, harmless, the kind of thing that made most Dominion officers dismiss humans as simple and unthreatening. That was usually the point. Being underestimated had its uses. The warden's head tilted slightly, studying me the way you might study an insect that had wandered somewhere it did not belong. "Humans," he said, and there was something almost pitying in the way the translator rendered it. "Report to Warden Command immediately if you see her. There is a bounty for information leading to her return." "Will do," I said, and went back to my coolant line. They moved on, checking the next bay, then the next, their footsteps fading into the general hum of the station. I counted to 200 before I finally let out the breath I had been holding. "You can come out now," I said quietly. She unfolded herself from behind the crates, brushing dust from her coat, her hands trembling. Up close, I could see a thin metal band around her wrist, etched with symbols I did not recognize, but understood instantly for what they were. A registration mark, ownership. "Thank you," she said. I did not expect a human to help me. I did not expect a human to be able to help me. There was no insult in the way she said it, just plain surprise, the kind that comes from a lifetime of being told what a species can and cannot do. "I get that a lot," I said, standing and wiping my hands on a rag. "Name's Ethan. Ethan Blake." "Vessa," she said. "Vessa Kellen." I wanted to ask her 100 questions right then. Who she was running from, what she had done, why the wardens wanted her badly enough to send 3 armed officers through a civilian docking bay. But something in her eyes told me she was barely holding herself together, and pushing would only make things worse. "You got somewhere safe to go?" I asked instead. "Family, friends, anyone?" She shook her head slowly. My family sold my contract to Lord Tarnak 3 cycles ago. He is the one who sent the wardens. If they take me back, he will have me reconditioned. Do you understand what that means?" I did not. Not exactly. But the fear in her voice painted a picture clear enough. I felt something tighten in my chest, an old, familiar anger that I usually kept buried under jokes and shrugs. "You're not going back there," I said, before I had even fully decided it myself. She looked at me like I had said something impossible. "You do not know what you are offering," she said. "The Dominion does not forgive humans who interfere with property disputes. If they catch you helping me, they will not simply fine you. They could revoke your entire species permit on this station. They could do worse." "I know exactly what I'm offering," I said, even though a small, sensible part of my brain was screaming that I had no plan, no resources, and no idea what I was about to walk into. "I'm offering to get you somewhere safe. After that, we figure out the rest." She stared at me for a long moment, searching my face for the catch, the angle, the thing every other person in her life had always wanted in return for help. When she did not find it, something in her posture eased, just slightly. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you risk this for someone you do not even know?" I thought about all the reasons I could give her. That my grandmother used to hide neighbors during hard times back home. That Earth's history was full of ordinary people who decided, at some point, that watching someone suffer was worse than any risk to themselves. That humans, whatever the Dominion thought of us, had never been very good at looking away. Instead, I just shrugged. "Because you asked," I said. "That's usually enough for me." The alarms on the station shifted pitch again, a longer tone this time, signaling a full lockdown search. My stomach dropped. A simple docking bay sweep was one thing. A station-wide lockdown meant Lord Tarnak had escalated this far faster than I expected, and that meant more wardens, more scanners, and a lot less room to hide in plain sight. "We need to move," I said. "Now." "Move where?" Vesa asked, glancing nervously at the bay entrance. "Every exit will be watched. They will scan every ship, every corridor, every maintenance shaft." I looked around the bay, my mind racing through every system I had worked on over the past 6 months, every panel I had repaired, every access code I had memorized out of boredom during long shifts. An idea started to form, rough and half-formed, but an idea nonetheless. "There's an old maintenance line that runs under the docking bays," I said, "used to service the original station frame before they built the newer sections on top. Most of the newer scanners don't even cover it, because officially it doesn't exist anymore. I found it by accident fixing a leak last month." Vesa's eyes widened slightly. "You are certain?" "Not even a little," I admitted. "But it's better than standing here waiting for them to circle back." She hesitated only a second before nodding. "Then show me," she said. I grabbed my tool bag, slung it over my shoulder, and led her toward a rusted service hatch tucked behind a bank of old cargo lifts, the kind of forgotten corner that only someone who had spent months crawling through the station's guts would ever notice. My hands shook slightly as I worked the manual release, the old mechanism groaning in protest after years of disuse. As the hatch creaked open, revealing a narrow, dark shaft leading down into the station's forgotten underlevels, I glanced back at Vesa one more time. "Once we go down there," I said, "there's no easy way back up if something goes wrong." She looked at the alarms flashing red along the corridor behind us, then back at the dark opening in front of us, and for the first time since she had stumbled into my life, I saw something other than fear in her expression. I saw resolve. "I stopped being safe the moment I ran into this bay," she said. "Let us go." I climbed in first, testing the old rungs bolted into the shaft wall, then reached back to help her down. The hatch sealed above us with a heavy clang, cutting off the alarms to a distant, muffled hum. Darkness swallowed us both, broken only by the small utility light clipped to my bag. Somewhere above, I knew, wardens were tearing through every corridor and cargo bay on the station, following orders from a man who considered Vesa nothing more than misplaced property. They had scanners, weapons, and the full authority of an empire that spanned 1,000 worlds behind them. All I had was an old maintenance tunnel, a bag of tools, and a stubborn refusal to let someone be dragged back into a life they were terrified of. It should not have been enough. But as we moved deeper into the dark together, I found myself thinking that maybe, just maybe, it was going to have to be. Neither of us said much as we made our way through the narrow shaft, our footsteps echoing softly against old metal plating that had not felt weight in years. Vesa moved carefully behind me, one hand trailing along the wall for balance, her breathing slowly steadying as the distance between us and the alarms grew. "You said you found this place fixing a leak," she said quietly, breaking the silence. "Does anyone else know it exists?" "Not that I know of," I said. "Station records list this whole section as decommissioned, officially sealed off decades ago when they expanded the docking rings. I only found the access hatch because a pressure valve was venting into a wall nobody was supposed to care about anymore." "Lucky for us," she murmured. "Lucky for us," I agreed, though a small part of me wondered how long that luck would hold once Lord Tarnak realized his usual methods were not going to work. I did not know it yet, standing there in that dark, forgotten tunnel with a stranger's life suddenly resting in my hands, but that quiet decision to help her was about to set off something far bigger than either of us could imagine, something that would not stay contained to one docking bay, or one station, or even one corner of Dominion space. For now, though, all that mattered was the next step forward, and the next, as we moved deeper into the dark together, leaving the alarms and the wardens and Lord Tarnak's cold ambitions somewhere far behind us, at least for the moment. The maintenance tunnel opened into a wider chamber, one filled with rusted pipes and dead control panels, and I finally let myself breathe. Vesa sat on an old crate, pulling her knees up to her chest, looking smaller than she had in the docking bay. The adrenaline that had carried her this far seemed to drain out of her all at once. "We can rest here for a while," I said, setting my bag down. "Nobody's coming down this deep, not without knowing exactly where to look." She nodded but did not relax. "Lord Tarnak will not stop searching," she said. "He does not lose property quietly. It embarrasses him in front of the council, and he does not tolerate embarrassment." I crouched near an old panel, popping it open out of habit, checking wiring that had not carried power in years. It gave my hands something to do, while my mind worked through what came next. "Tell me about him," I said. "If I'm going to help you disappear, I need to know what we're actually dealing with." Vesa was quiet for a moment, staring at nothing in particular. "Lord Tarnak is a mid-tier noble," she said finally. "Not powerful enough to sit on the High Council, but wealthy enough to buy influence with those who do. He collects things, rare artifacts, rare creatures, rare people. I was purchased 3 cycles ago from my family's debt holder, meant to serve as a companion and translator for his diplomatic functions." "And you ran," I said. "I ran because 2 nights ago I overheard him speaking with a warden commander about a shipment," she said, her voice dropping lower. "Not goods. People. Severins mostly, but others too. Species the Dominion considers expendable. He is not just collecting rare things, Ethan. He is trading in them." The word hung heavy in the stale tunnel air. I had heard rumors before, quiet whispers among station workers about certain nobles who dealt in things the Dominion officially condemned but quietly allowed, as long as it stayed profitable and out of sight. I had never had proof. Now I was sitting across from someone who did. "You have evidence?" I asked. "Fragments," she said. "A data chip I copied before I ran. Shipping manifests, coded but decipherable if you know what to look for. It is not enough on its own to bring him down, but it is enough to make him desperate to get me back before anyone else sees it." That changed things. This was not simply a frightened woman escaping an unpleasant master. This was someone who had accidentally stumbled onto something that could unravel a powerful man's entire operation, and now that man wanted her silenced before the truth spread any further. I sat back on my heels, processing everything, feeling the weight of the situation settle over me like a physical thing. "Okay," I said slowly, "then we don't just need to hide you. We need somewhere that data chip is actually safe, and eventually, someone with enough authority to act on it who isn't already bought and paid for by men like Tarnak." Vesa let out a short, humorless laugh. "Do you know how rare such a person is in the Dominion?" "I don't know the Dominion that well," I admitted, "but I know people, and I know that even in a system this big, there are always a few who haven't given up on doing the right thing. We just have to find them before Tarnak finds you." She studied me for a long moment, the way someone studies a puzzle piece that does not quite fit the picture they expected. "You keep saying we," she said, "as if this is now your problem as much as mine." I shrugged, standing and brushing dust from my knees. The moment I told those wardens I hadn't seen anyone, it became my problem. Might as well see it through properly. A distant clang echoed through the tunnel system, faint but unmistakable, the sound of a hatch being forced somewhere above us. Vesa's head snapped up, her earlier calm shattering instantly. "They found the access point," she whispered. I grabbed my bag, already moving. "Then we don't stay here another minute." We moved quickly through the winding maintenance corridors, my memory of the layout patchy at best, built from months of half-remembered repair jobs rather than any actual map. Every turn felt like a gamble, every echo behind us like it might be footsteps closing in. Vesa kept pace easily despite her earlier exhaustion, fear apparently a powerful motivator. We came to a junction where 3 tunnels split apart, and I hesitated, trying to remember which one led toward the lower cargo processing center, the one place on this station where enough noise and crowd cover might actually help us rather than expose us. "This way," I said, choosing the left tunnel more on instinct than certainty. We had gone maybe 50 meters when a beam of harsh white light swept across the tunnel behind us, followed immediately by a sharp mechanical voice amplified through a warden's external speaker. "Halt! This corridor is under Dominion Search Authority. Identify yourselves immediately." "Run," I said, and we did. The tunnel narrowed ahead, forcing us into single file, and I could hear the heavy, measured footsteps of warden armor gaining behind us, augmented strength making their pursuit far faster than anything a normal humanoid frame could manage. Vesa was fast, but not fast enough to outrun that indefinitely, and neither was I. Ahead, I spotted something I had genuinely forgotten about until that exact moment. A narrow maintenance shaft running vertically upward, barely wide enough for a single person, sealed with an old manual crankwheel rather than any modern locking mechanism. It led, if my memory served, directly into one of the lower cargo processing bays. "Up there," I said, pointing. "It's tight, but it should get us into the cargo bay. Once we're in the crowd down there, we've got a better chance of losing them." Vesa did not question it. She climbed first, her longer limbs making quick work of the narrow rungs, while I followed close behind, my heart pounding against my ribs as the sound of warden footsteps grew louder in the tunnel below us. We reached the top just as a shout echoed up from beneath, and I slammed the crankwheel shut behind us, spinning it hard until the old mechanism locked with a satisfying clunk. It would not hold forever against warden strength, but it would buy us precious seconds. The cargo bay beyond was loud and crowded, dozens of workers and automated loaders moving crates between towering stacks of shipping containers, the kind of organized chaos that made it easy to disappear into if you knew how to move without drawing attention. "Stay close," I said, pulling my jacket hood up and gesturing for Vesa to do the same with her coat. "Walk like you belong here. Don't look back." We moved through the crowd, weaving between loaders and stacked crates, my pulse hammering with every step, expecting at any moment to hear that cold mechanical voice demanding we halt again. But the noise and motion of the cargo bay swallowed us whole, just 2 more figures among dozens of workers finishing their shifts. We made it nearly to the far exit before I heard the alarm shift again, a station-wide announcement this time, echoing through every speaker in the massive bay. "Attention all personnel. A Dominion search is currently underway for a fugitive Severin and an accomplice believed to be human. Any information should be reported immediately to Warden Command. Cooperation will be rewarded. Interference will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of Dominion law. Every head in the cargo bay seemed to turn slightly at the announcement, a ripple of curiosity and caution passing through the crowd. I felt Vesa tense beside me, her hand instinctively finding my sleeve and gripping it tight. "Keep walking," I murmured under my breath. Panicking now gets us caught faster than anything else. We reached the far exit, a service corridor leading toward the residential sections of the station, and slipped through just as a pair of wardens entered the cargo bay from the opposite side, scanning the crowd with methodical precision. My legs felt weak with relief once the door sealed behind us, cutting off our view of them. "That was too close," Vesa breathed, leaning against the corridor wall for a moment. "It's about to get closer," I said grimly. "Once they realize we made it out of that cargo bay, they'll lock down every residential corridor next. We need somewhere off the main grid, somewhere that doesn't show up on standard station scans." Vesa straightened, wiping a hand across her face, steadying herself with visible effort. "Do you have such a place?" she asked. I thought of Marcus Webb, an old friend from back on Earth, who had taken a maintenance contract on Caldris Station a year before I arrived, and who now lived in one of the older, half-forgotten residential blocks near the station's original construction core. Marcus had never been the type to ask too many questions, and he owed me more than a few favors from jobs I had covered for him over the years. "Maybe," I said. "Come on, it's not far, but we need to move fast." We made our way through a series of narrow back corridors, avoiding the main thoroughfares where security scanners were densest, cutting through service junctions I had only ever used for work, never imagining I would one day need them to keep someone safe from an Empire's enforcers. Marcus's door was tucked into a quiet corner of an aging residential block, the kind of place where the paint had long since faded and half the light panels flickered unevenly. I knocked twice, then 3 times quickly, an old signal from back when we used to work night shifts together and needed a way to tell friends from strangers. The door slid open a crack, revealing a wiry man with tired eyes and a half-grown beard, blinking at us in confusion. "Ethan," he said slowly, "it's the middle of my sleep cycle. What in every star system are you doing here?" "I need a place to lay low for a bit," I said quietly, glancing down the corridor to make sure it was empty. "And I need you to not ask too many questions for the next few hours." Marcus's gaze shifted to Vesa standing just behind me, taking in her Severan features, her expensive coat, the fear still lingering in her eyes despite her attempts to hide it. Understanding dawned slowly on his face. "This about that station-wide alert?" he asked, voice dropping to a whisper. "Maybe," I admitted. He was quiet for a long moment, weighing something in his mind, before finally stepping back and pulling the door open wider. "Get in here before someone sees you standing in my hallway like a couple of idiots," he muttered. We slipped inside, and the door hissed shut behind us, sealing out the corridor lights and the distant hum of the station's ongoing search. For the first time since the alarms had first sounded in that docking bay, I allowed myself a small, cautious breath of relief. It would not last long. I could feel it already, the sense that we had bought ourselves hours, not days, and that Lord Tarnak's reach on this station was far deeper than a few wardens sweeping corridors. But for now, we were safe, and Vesa was still free, and the data chip she carried was still hidden against her skin beneath her coat, waiting for someone with enough courage or enough recklessness to actually do something with it. I looked at her, standing uncertainly in the middle of Marcus's cramped quarters, still trembling slightly from the chase, and made a quiet promise to myself that I intended to keep no matter what it cost me. Whatever happened next, I was not going to let her go back to that man, even if it meant standing against an entire empire to keep that promise. Marcus's quarters were small, cluttered with spare parts and half-finished repair jobs, but they had one thing most places on Caldris Station did not: a hand-built signal shield he had rigged years ago to keep his personal comms private from station monitoring. It was not much, but it meant we could talk freely, without worrying about every word being logged somewhere in a Dominion database. "So," Marcus said, dropping into a worn chair and crossing his arms, "are either of you going to explain what exactly I just let into my home, or am I supposed to guess?" I glanced at Vesa, who nodded slightly, giving her silent permission for me to explain. I laid it out as simply as I could: the docking bay, the wardens, Lord Tarnak, the data chip hidden against her skin, the trading operation it apparently exposed. Marcus listened without interrupting, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief to something darker as the picture became clear. "You're telling me," he said slowly, once I finished, "that you've got evidence of a Dominion noble running some kind of trafficking operation, and instead of doing the smart thing and staying far away from it, you decided to personally get involved." "When you say it like that, it does sound a little reckless," I admitted. "A little," Marcus repeated flatly. "Ethan, you know what happens to humans who get caught interfering in noble business. Our whole species' permit on this station is provisional. One incident, and Dominion Command could pull it entirely. Every human on Caldris loses their work contracts, their housing, everything." "I know," I said quietly. "I thought about that. I'm still not walking away." Vesa spoke up then, her voice steady despite everything she had been through. "He is right to be cautious," she said, looking at Marcus. "I would understand if neither of you wanted any part of this. It is not your fight." Marcus studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his tired eyes. "You know," he said finally, "my grandmother used to tell me stories about her grandmother, who lived through some pretty ugly years back on Earth, before humanity got its act together. People who saw something wrong and looked away because it wasn't their problem. She always said the ones who mattered most were the ones who decided it was their problem anyway." He sighed, running a hand through his hair, then stood up and crossed to an old storage locker built into the wall. "I'm not saying I'm thrilled about this," he continued, pulling out a small data terminal and setting it on the table. "But I'm not going to be the guy who turned away someone running from that kind of evil either. Let's see what's actually on this chip of yours before we decide anything else." Vesa reached beneath her coat collar and carefully removed a thin, nearly invisible data strip from where it had been hidden against her skin. She handed it to Marcus, who inserted it into his terminal with practiced hands, running a series of decryption protocols that flickered rapidly across the small screen. "This is going to take a few minutes," he muttered, eyes fixed on the scrolling code. Whoever encrypted this knew what they were doing. While we waited, I found myself pacing the small room, my mind racing through everything that had happened in the last few hours. It felt impossible that only that morning I had been a bored contractor fixing coolant lines, worrying about nothing more complicated than whether my supply requisition would be approved on time. Now I was hiding a fugitive in a friend's apartment while Dominion wardens tore apart the station looking for us. Vesa sat quietly on the edge of a storage crate, watching Marcus work, her earlier fear settling into something more like exhausted determination. "Can I ask you something?" I said, sitting down across from her. "Of course," she replied. "What will you do," I asked, "if we actually manage to get this evidence to someone who can act on it? If Tarnak is exposed, what happens to you after that?" She was quiet for a long moment, considering the question as if she had not allowed herself to think that far ahead. "I do not know," she admitted finally. "My registration is still legally tied to him unless his ownership claim is formally revoked. Even if he faces consequences for trafficking, there is no guarantee my status changes with it. The Dominion's laws around property rights are old, and they do not bend easily, even for good reasons." That struck me as deeply unfair, though I supposed I should not have been surprised. A system that allowed one sentient being to legally own another was never going to be quick to correct itself, even when confronted with clear evidence of wrongdoing. "Then we make sure it changes," I said firmly, "whatever it takes." Vesa looked at me with an expression I could not quite read, somewhere between disbelief and something warmer. You keep making promises you cannot possibly guarantee, she said softly. Maybe, I admitted, but I've found that sometimes just deciding to try changes what's actually possible. Marcus's terminal chimed suddenly, drawing both our attention. Got something, he said, leaning forward. This is bigger than I expected. He turned the screen toward us, displaying rows of shipping manifests, coded cargo designations, and transaction records spanning several months. Vesa leaned in, her eyes scanning the data with practiced familiarity. These are transport logs, she explained, pointing at various entries, officially listed as livestock and rare specimen transfers. But look at the destination codes here and here. Those are private processing facilities registered to shell companies that all trace back to holdings controlled by Lord Tarnak. And the cargo? Marcus asked quietly. Vesa's jaw tightened. Sentient beings, she said. Severans, mostly, but also several other lesser recognized species the Dominion does not grant full citizenship protections to. Species poor enough or politically insignificant enough that their disappearance draws little official attention. The weight of what we were looking at settled heavily over the small room. This was not a minor smuggling operation or a personal grudge between Vesa and a cruel owner. This was systematic exploitation, hidden behind layers of bureaucracy and shell corporations, protected by wealth and status that made it nearly untouchable through normal channels. How many? I asked quietly, though part of me almost did not want to know the answer. Vesa scrolled through several more entries, her expression growing grimmer with each one. Based on these logs alone, she said finally, at least several hundred individuals over the past 2 years, and this is only the portion of his operation I managed to access before I fled. There could be far more we do not know about. Marcus leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. Okay, he said, this isn't just about keeping one person safe anymore. This is the kind of thing that could bring down a noble house if it got in front of the right eyes. Which brings us back to the original problem, I said. Who exactly are the right eyes? Someone with enough authority to act on this, but not already bought off by men like Tarnak. Vesa was quiet for a moment, clearly thinking through options I had no context for. Finally, she spoke. There is an Inspector General assigned to oversee trade compliance across this sector, she said slowly. Inspector Cale Doran. I met him once, years ago, during one of Tarnak's diplomatic functions. He struck me as unusually principled for someone in Dominion administration. He asked pointed questions others avoided. It earned him few friends among the nobility. That sounds promising, Marcus said cautiously. But how do we even get in front of someone like that without going through official channels that Tarnak could easily intercept? That was the real problem, and I could feel the shape of it settling over all three of us. We had evidence that could expose a massive trafficking operation, but no safe way to deliver it to someone who could actually act on it, not without risking interception by Tarnak's allies within the Dominion bureaucracy itself. I stood and walked to the small window overlooking the station's lower residential ring, watching distant lights flicker across the metal landscape outside, thinking through every option, however unlikely. What if we didn't go through official channels at all? I said slowly, an idea beginning to take shape in my mind. Marcus raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? I turned back to face them both. You said Tarnak has allies within the bureaucracy who could intercept this if we go through normal reporting procedures, I said. So what if we make it impossible for them to bury it? What if instead of quietly handing this to one inspector, we make sure enough people see it at once that burying it becomes impossible? Vesa's eyes widened slightly. You are suggesting we make this public. Not just public, I said, the idea solidifying further as I spoke. Public enough and widespread enough that no single noble house, no matter how wealthy, can quietly make it disappear. If Tarnak's allies try to bury this through normal channels, we make sure copies already exist everywhere they'd need to look. Marcus stared at me like I had lost my mind. Ethan, he said carefully, do you understand what you're proposing? That's not just interfering in noble business anymore. That's directly challenging Dominion information control protocols. That's the kind of thing that gets entire species permits revoked, or worse. I know, I said quietly. But think about what happens if we don't. Vesa goes back to Tarnak, or spends the rest of her life hiding in the shadows of one station or another, always one step ahead of wardens who never stop looking. And Tarnak keeps operating exactly as he has been, because nobody with enough courage or leverage ever forces the issue. The room fell silent except for the distant hum of the station's ventilation systems. Vesa looked between the two of us, her expression a complicated mixture of hope and fear. If we do this, she said slowly, there will be no going back for any of us. Tarnak will not simply give up his search. He will see this as a direct attack, and men like him do not forgive attacks quietly. I know, I said again, and found that despite the very real fear settling in my stomach, I meant it completely. But some things are worth doing anyway. Marcus rubbed a hand over his face, muttering something under his breath that sounded like a curse, in 3 different languages, before finally looking up at me with a resigned expression. You know I'm going to help you anyway, don't you? He said, even though this is possibly the worst idea you've ever had. Probably, I agreed, allowing myself a small, tired smile despite everything. He shook his head, already turning back to his terminal, fingers moving quickly across the interface. Then let's figure out exactly how insane this plan needs to be, he said, because if we're doing this, we're doing it properly, or not at all. Over the next several hours, the 3 of us worked through every detail we could think of, mapping out which networks might carry the information fastest, which independent journalists or information brokers across Dominion space had reputations for refusing bribes, which backup systems might preserve copies even if primary transmissions were intercepted or destroyed. It was slow, careful, exhausting work, made more difficult by the constant awareness that somewhere above us, wardens were still searching every corridor and residential block on the station, following orders from a man who would stop at nothing to keep his secrets buried and his property returned. But as the hours passed, and our plan slowly took shape, I found myself feeling something I had not expected amid all the fear and uncertainty. A quiet, steady sense of purpose, the kind that comes from finally deciding to stand for something larger than your own safety or comfort. Vesa caught me watching her at one point, studying the data scrolling across Marcus's terminal with fierce concentration, and offered a small, tired smile of her own. Whatever happens next, she said quietly, thank you for not looking away. I looked back at her, at the quiet strength she had shown through every terrifying hour since she had first stumbled into that docking bay, and shook my head slightly. Don't thank me yet, I said. We haven't even gotten to the hard part. She let out a soft, surprised laugh, the first genuine sound of amusement I had heard from her since we met, and for just a moment, despite everything hanging over us, it felt like maybe, just maybe, we actually had a chance. Outside, the station's alarms continued their steady, distant pulse, a reminder that our time was limited and the danger was far from over. But for the first time since this had all begun, I felt like we were no longer simply running. We were finally about to fight back. By the time the station's artificial night cycle rolled into early morning hours, our plan had taken a shape none of us fully loved, but all of us agreed, gave us the best possible chance. Marcus had spent years quietly building contacts across various stations, other technicians and contractors who traded favors and information the way old friends traded stories. It turned out that network was far larger and more useful than I had ever realized. We are not just sending this to one inspector, Marcus explained, pulling up a rough diagram on his terminal showing dozens of connection points scattered across different stations and systems. We are sending encrypted copies to at least 20 independent contacts across 6 different systems, all timed to release simultaneously. Journalists, information brokers, a few sympathetic administrators who have no love for corrupt nobles. Even if Tarnak's allies intercept some, they cannot possibly catch all of them before the information spreads too far to bury. Vesa studied the diagram carefully, her analytical mind clearly working through possible weaknesses. "What about Inspector Doran?" she asked. "Should he not receive a direct copy as well, given his official authority?" "He will," Marcus confirmed, "but not first. If we send it directly to him initially, and Tarnak has even one informant watching Doran's official channels, this dies before it ever reaches wider attention. He gets his copy at the same moment as everyone else, which actually protects him too. He cannot be accused of colluding with fugitives if the information simply appears publicly at the same time it reaches his desk. It was a smart approach, though it came with real risks. Once this information went out, there would be no controlling how it spread, no way to manage the fallout, or protect any of us from whatever consequences followed. But the alternative, quietly sitting on evidence of a massive trafficking operation while Vesa spent the rest of her life hiding, felt entirely unacceptable. "There is still the problem of the actual transmission," Vesa said. "Sending this volume of data simultaneously to that many recipients will require significant bandwidth. Station monitoring systems will almost certainly detect unusual transmission patterns, especially with active search alerts already in place for us." Marcus nodded grimly. "That's the part I haven't fully solved yet," he admitted. "We need an access point that isn't tied to my personal terminal, something that can handle this kind of transmission without immediately flagging back to this apartment." I thought for a long moment, running through every system I had worked on during my months as a station contractor, every access panel and network junction I had ever repaired or maintained. And then, slowly, an idea began forming, one that felt both reckless and strangely fitting given everything else we had already risked. "The old communications relay," I said slowly. "The one in the abandoned section near where I found that maintenance tunnel. It's officially decommissioned, same as everything else in that part of the station, but I checked the wiring last month out of curiosity. The physical hardware is still intact, even if nobody's used it in years. If we can get power routed to it, it should still be able to handle a transmission like this." Marcus considered this, frowning slightly. "That's a long shot, Ethan. Decommissioned equipment that old, there's no guarantee it even still functions properly, let alone handles the kind of data load we're talking about." "It's not a guarantee," I agreed, "but it's disconnected from any monitored network. Nobody's watching traffic through equipment that officially doesn't exist anymore. If it works, we get our transmission out clean, without immediately revealing exactly where it came from." Vesa looked between the two of us, weighing the risk. "It is worth attempting," she said finally. "We have limited time regardless. Every hour we wait increases the chance Tarnak's search expands further, or that he finds another way to locate us through less obvious means." We spent the next hour gathering what equipment we could: portable power cells, spare cabling, tools I had used dozens of times for far less consequential repairs. Marcus prepared the data package itself, layering additional encryption around the core evidence while ensuring it would still be readable once decrypted by the intended recipients. As we prepared to leave, Marcus caught my arm briefly, his expression serious. "Ethan," he said quietly, "once this goes out, there's no version of this where things go back to normal. Not for you, not for me, not for any human on this station. If this works the way we're hoping, it exposes not just Tarnak, but potentially cracks in Dominion oversight that a lot of powerful people would rather stayed hidden. That kind of attention, it changes things." "I know," I said, and found that despite the fear tightening in my chest, my resolve had not wavered. "Good," he said, releasing my arm and offering a small, tired smile, "because I think it needs to change." We made our way back through the station's forgotten maintenance corridors, moving carefully to avoid the patrol patterns Marcus had mapped out, based on the search announcements still echoing periodically through station speakers. Vesa moved close beside me, her earlier fear replaced by something steadier, a quiet determination that matched my own. The old communications relay sat exactly where I remembered, a hulking piece of outdated equipment tucked into a forgotten alcove, coated in years of dust but structurally intact. I worked quickly, running diagnostic checks with tools I had brought, relieved to find that despite its age, the core systems remained functional. Power routing looks stable, I reported, connecting the portable cells Marcus had prepared. Give me a few minutes to get the transmission array calibrated. Vesa knelt beside me, watching my hands move across old, unfamiliar controls with focused intensity. You are remarkably calm for someone about to challenge an empire, she observed. I let out a short, slightly nervous laugh. I'm terrified, I admitted. I'm just better at hiding it when I've got something specific to focus on. She smiled slightly at that, a small, genuine expression that eased some of the tension in my chest, despite everything hanging over us. For what it is worth, she said quietly, I am grateful you are the one who found me hiding in that docking bay. I do not know that anyone else would have done what you have done these past hours. Anyone decent would have, I said, though I suspected that was not entirely true. The Dominion's own history suggested decency was not always common, even among species that considered themselves civilized. The transmission array finally hummed to life, old systems groaning back into operation after years of dormancy. Marcus's voice crackled through a small handheld communicator I carried, his signal shield allowing us at least this much secure contact, despite the distance between us. Package is ready on my end, he said. Just say the word, and I'll initiate the send the moment you confirm the relay is stable. I ran one final check across the old equipment, watching indicator lights flicker steadily across the console, confirming everything was functioning as well as decades-old hardware reasonably could. We're good here, I said into the communicator. Send it. There was a brief pause, then Marcus's voice returned, tight with tension. Transmission initiated. Routing through your relay now. This is going to take several minutes given the data volume. Keep that connection stable no matter what. The console in front of me lit up with activity indicators, data streaming out through the old relay system toward its scattered destinations across Dominion space. I watched the numbers climb slowly, painfully aware of every passing second, every moment we remained exposed in this forgotten corner of the station. That was when the alarm nearest our position suddenly blared to life, far closer than any of the search announcements we had heard before. Unauthorized power draw detected in decommissioned Section 7, a cold mechanical voice announced through a nearby speaker I had not even realized was still functional. Security response dispatched immediately. Vesa's head snapped toward me, alarm clear on her face. They know we are here, she said. Transmission's only at 60%, I said, checking the console with rising panic. If we cut it now, the data package might not transmit completely, and there's no guarantee we get another chance at this. We do not have the luxury of completing it safely, Vesa said, already moving toward the alcove entrance to check the corridor beyond. I can hear them approaching already. I made a split-second decision, one that felt reckless even as I made it. I'm not leaving until this finishes, I said, staying crouched at the console. Get somewhere safer. I'll catch up once it's done. Absolutely not, Vesa said firmly, turning back toward me with fierce determination in her eyes. You did not abandon me in that docking bay. I am not abandoning you here. There was no time to argue further. The sound of approaching footsteps grew louder in the corridor beyond our hiding spot, heavy and measured, unmistakably Warden armor closing in fast. 70%, I muttered, watching the transmission numbers climb with agonizing slowness. Come on, come on. Vesa moved to the alcove entrance, positioning herself where she could watch the approaching corridor while still remaining mostly hidden from direct view. I do not suppose you have any weapons among your tools, she asked quietly. Nothing that would do much against Warden armor, I admitted. I've got a plasma cutter, but that's meant for cutting metal, not fighting trained soldiers. 80%, the console indicated, and I felt a small surge of hope despite the rapidly closing danger. We were close, agonizingly close, but the footsteps in the corridor were closer still, and I could now hear the low hum of Warden's scanning equipment sweeping the area ahead of them. There, a mechanical voice called out, sharp and immediate. Movement detected in Alcove 7. All units converge immediately. 90%, I said, my voice tight with tension. Vesa, Whatever happens, if this finishes and something happens to me, you take that data and you run. You make sure it gets confirmed by whoever receives it. Promise me." "I will not need to make such a promise," she said firmly, "because we are both getting out of this together." The first warden rounded the corner into our alcove, just as the console finally chimed, displaying a single word that felt like the sweetest sound I had ever heard. Complete. The transmission had gone out, fully and completely, scattered across 20 different recipients throughout Dominion space. Evidence of Lord Tarnak's trafficking operation, now beyond any single person's ability to quietly bury or destroy. The warden's weapon rose immediately, targeting systems locking onto both of us with cold mechanical precision. "Remain still," the translator flattened voice commanded. "You are both under arrest for interference with Dominion search operations and unauthorized use of restricted equipment." I raised my hand slowly, my mind racing even as adrenaline flooded through my system. Vesa stood beside me, her posture straight and unafraid despite the weapon pointed in our direction. "It's done," I said quietly, more to myself than to the warden standing before us. "Whatever happens now, it's already done." The warden's head tilted slightly, some kind of internal communication clearly passing through his helmet's systems, before his posture shifted, becoming somehow more rigid, more alert. "Command override received," he said finally, his mechanical voice carrying an odd note I could not quite place. "All units stand down from immediate engagement. Priority alert issued across Sector Command regarding unauthorized data distribution matching current search parameters." Vesa glanced at me, confusion and cautious hope mixing in her expression. "What does that mean?" she whispered. I did not know for certain, but as more wardens filed into the alcove behind the first, their movements suddenly less aggressive and more uncertain, I began to suspect that whatever had just happened extended far beyond our immediate situation. Somewhere across Dominion space, in offices and command centers we would never see, our transmission had just landed, and its ripples were already spreading in ways none of us could have predicted only hours before. We had wanted to expose one corrupt noble's crimes. What we had actually done, I was beginning to realize with a mixture of terror and reluctant satisfaction, was force an entire empire to suddenly pay very close attention to two people it had, until this moment, considered utterly insignificant. And empires, I was quickly learning, did not particularly enjoy being caught off guard. They did not arrest us that night, though they did not exactly let us go free either. Instead, we were escorted, under heavy guard but without restraints, to a secure administrative section of the station I had never even known existed, one reserved for matters that apparently required attention well above the pay grade of standard warden patrols. Marcus was already there when we arrived, looking exhausted but unharmed, having been picked up from his apartment shortly after our transmission went out. He caught my eye across the room and offered a small, tired nod, confirming without words that he was all right. We waited in tense silence for nearly 2 hours before the doors finally opened, and a tall, sharp-featured Dominion official strode in, flanked by 2 aides carrying data terminals. His uniform bore markings I did not recognize, but the way every warden in the room straightened at his entrance told me this was someone of real authority. "I am Inspector General Cale Doran," he said, his translator rendered voice carrying none of the flat coldness I had come to expect from Dominion officers. "I received a rather extraordinary data package roughly 3 hours ago, along with confirmation that identical packages reached 19 other recipients across 6 systems simultaneously. I understand the 3 of you are responsible." Nobody answered immediately, uncertain whether admitting responsibility would help or harm our situation at this point. Doran's sharp eyes moved across each of us in turn before settling on Vesa. "You are the Severin registered to Lord Tarnak's household," he said. "The one his people have been searching this station for over the past day." "I am," Vesa confirmed, her voice steady despite everything. "And the evidence contained within that transmission," Doran continued, "is that evidence you personally gathered while under his ownership." "It is," she said. Doran was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an expression I could not quite read. Then he turned his attention to me and Marcus. "And you two decided to help her," he said, "knowing full well the risks involved for both of you, and for your entire species' permit status on this station." "We did," I said, deciding there was little point in denying anything at this stage. Doran's expression shifted slightly, something that might have been the beginning of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, though it was difficult to read alien expressions with complete certainty. "Do you have any idea," he said slowly, "what you have actually done? The data contained in that transmission does not simply implicate Lord Tarnak in a trafficking operation involving several hundred sentient beings. It reveals connections extending into at least 3 other noble households and troubling gaps in oversight protocols that certain officials have apparently been exploiting for years." My stomach tightened at that. We hadn't just exposed one man. We had accidentally pulled a thread that was now unraveling something far larger and more deeply rooted than any of us had realized. "Is that a problem?" Marcus asked cautiously. "For you 3, Doran said, "it means you have made some very powerful enemies in a very short amount of time. For the Dominion as a whole, it means we are facing the largest corruption investigation this sector has seen in over a century, one that will likely take years to fully resolve." He paused, glancing down at the data terminal one of his aides handed him, scrolling through information none of us could see. "However," he continued, "it also means that the 3 of you currently represent the most significant witnesses and evidence sources in a case that several very senior officials are now personally invested in seeing through to completion. That grants you a certain degree of protection, at least for the immediate future." Vesa stepped forward slightly, her posture tense with restrained hope. "What of my registration status?" she asked. "My ownership contract with Lord Tarnak." Doran's expression turned serious. "Given the evidence you provided, and your clear cooperation with this investigation, I am authorized to immediately suspend Lord Tarnak's ownership claims pending the outcome of formal proceedings against him. Whether that suspension becomes permanent will depend on the investigation's findings, though given what we have already confirmed, I would not expect Lord Tarnak to retain any legal standing to reclaim you once this concludes." I felt something loosen in my chest at those words, watching relief and disbelief wash over Vesa's face in equal measure. It was not a complete guarantee, not yet, but it was far more than she could have hoped for only a day earlier. Doran turned his attention back to me and Marcus, his expression thoughtful. "As for you 2, he said, "I imagine there will be some within Dominion administration who view your involvement as exactly the kind of human overreach that justifies tightening restrictions on your species permits even further." My heart sank slightly at that, though I supposed I had expected as much. "However," Doran continued, "there will be others, myself included, who recognize that without your willingness to act, this evidence might never have reached anyone capable of acting on it. Corruption this deeply entrenched does not expose itself. It requires people willing to take risks that more cautious, more comfortable individuals would avoid." He studied us both for a long moment before continuing. "I cannot promise you this incident will not have consequences," he said honestly. "Powerful people have been embarrassed and threatened by what you exposed, and such people rarely forgive easily. But I can promise that within the bounds of my authority, I will ensure this is recognized as an act that served Dominion law, not one that violated it. It was not a perfect resolution, not the kind of clean, triumphant ending that made everything simple and easy. But standing there in that quiet administrative office, exhausted and uncertain about exactly what came next, it felt like enough." The following weeks passed in a strange blur of formal interviews, testimony sessions, and cautious waiting as the investigation Doran had described slowly expanded across the sector. News of the scandal spread far beyond Caldris Station, reaching other systems, other species, sparking conversations about oversight and corruption that officials had apparently been avoiding for far too long. Lord Tarnak was formally stripped of his noble titles within the first month, his assets frozen pending trial, his trafficking network dismantled piece by piece as investigators followed the threads Vessa's evidence had first exposed. Several other noble houses faced similar scrutiny, their own hidden dealings dragged reluctantly into the light. Vessa's registration was permanently voided within 6 weeks. Her status shifted to full independent citizenship under a provision Doran had apparently fought hard to secure, one that recognized cooperating witnesses in major corruption cases as deserving full legal personhood regardless of prior ownership contracts. As for the human community on Caldris Station, the reaction proved more complicated than any of us had expected. Some officials did indeed push for tightened restrictions, viewing our actions as dangerous overreach that set an uncomfortable precedent. But others, quietly at first and then more openly, began speaking of humanity differently than before. Word spread, as these things do, beyond just our station. Other humans scattered across Dominion space, contractors and workers who had spent years being treated as harmless and insignificant, began hearing about what had happened. Some reached out to Marcus's old network, sharing their own stories of quiet resistance, small acts of decency that had gone unnoticed until now. It was not an organized movement, not yet, but something had shifted, a quiet recognition among humans scattered across 1,000 worlds that perhaps they had been underestimating their own potential as much as the Dominion had been underestimating them. I found Vessa one evening, several months after everything had settled into a new, uncertain normal, standing on an observation deck overlooking the vast expanse of stars beyond Caldris Station. She had taken a position as a formal liaison within Doran's ongoing investigation, using her knowledge of noble household operations to help identify further corruption across the sector. "You look thoughtful," I said, joining her at the viewport. She glanced at me, a small smile touching her features, one that had become far more common in recent months than the fear that had defined our first meeting. "I was thinking about that day in the docking bay," she said. "How certain I was that a human could not possibly help me in any meaningful way, how wrong that assumption turned out to be." I leaned against the railing beside her, watching the distant stars scatter across the endless black beyond the station's hull. In my defense, I said I wasn't entirely sure I could help either. I just knew I couldn't walk away. Vessa was quiet for a moment, studying the stars with an expression I had come to recognize as deep in thought. "Do you know what troubles the Dominion most about what happened?" she asked eventually. "It is not simply the corruption we exposed, though that alone has created significant upheaval. It is the realization that humanity, a species they considered too disorganized and insignificant to matter, proved capable of shaking an empire simply by refusing to look away from injustice." I considered that for a moment, thinking about everything that had happened since that alarm first sounded in the docking bay, about Marcus's quiet courage, about Doran's willingness to act when so many others might have stayed silent, about Vessa's own bravery in gathering evidence that had put her entire life at risk. "Maybe that's the thing they got wrong from the start," I said finally. "They measured us by our technology, our military strength, our political influence. They never stopped to consider that sometimes the most dangerous thing about a species isn't what they can build or destroy. It's simply their refusal to accept things that are wrong, even when accepting them would be so much easier." Vessa turned to look at me fully then, something warm and genuine in her expression. "That refusal," she said softly, "changed my entire life. I do not think I will ever be able to fully express how grateful I am that you happened to be the human working in that docking bay on that particular day." I smiled, feeling something settle comfortably in my chest, despite everything we had been through. "I'm just glad I could help," I said simply. Word continued to spread in the months that followed, stories of what had happened on Caldris Station, reaching further corners of Dominion space than any of us could have anticipated. Other incidents began surfacing, other quiet acts of human resistance against injustices that powerful beings had assumed would go unnoticed and unchallenged forever. The Dominion, an empire that had spanned 1,000 worlds and considered itself unshakable in its authority and understanding of every species within its borders, found itself facing an uncomfortable new reality. Humanity, dismissed for so long as insignificant and harmless, had proven itself capable of something far more dangerous than military might or political maneuvering. We had proven ourselves capable of simply refusing to look away, and once that refusal took root, once it spread from one small act of kindness in a forgotten docking bay to a network of quiet resistance spanning entire systems, there was no putting it back. I never set out to alarm an empire. I had simply seen someone frightened and alone, asking for help, and had done the only thing that felt right in that moment. But sometimes, I was slowly coming to understand, the smallest acts of decency carry consequences far larger than anyone could ever predict. Sometimes helping one person who asks turns into standing against corruption that has festered for generations. Sometimes simply refusing to look away becomes the spark that finally forces an entire system to confront truths it had spent centuries avoiding. The Dominion was not overthrown that day, nor in the months that followed. Empires, I learned, do not fall so easily or so quickly. But something had shifted, something fundamental in how humanity was perceived across 1,000 worlds, and that shift, however small it might have seemed in the moment, had already begun rippling outward in ways none of us could fully predict. Standing there on that observation deck, watching the stars stretch endlessly beyond the station's hull, with Vesa beside me and the quiet knowledge that Marcus and Doran and countless others now stood as allies in whatever came next, I found myself thinking that maybe this was only the beginning. Not of some grand conquest or rebellion, nothing so dramatic or simple, just the beginning of an empire slowly, cautiously, reluctantly learning that it had never truly understood the species it had spent so long underestimating. And for humanity scattered across those 1,000 worlds, quietly building connections and courage, one small act of decency at a time, that realization was only the first step towards something far greater still to come.